Well, welcome to this fine April afternoon. It's beautiful where I am. Cloudless, blue skies, and nice temperature. Many of us remember last year when John Paoletti gave his fascinating talk on the Medici family and how they used art as a tool in their quest to convert Florence from a republic into an autocracy. Florentine art has been one of special love, really since his freshman year at Yale, when he was under the guidance of Charlie Seymour. As a very popular Wesleyan professor, and John was revered there, as I've said before, much in the same way as Vincent Scully was revered at Yale. John's courses are reportedly one of the most popular ones at Wesleyan, where he taught for 37 years. I asked John to return, if he would, with a focus on Michelangelo, because Michelangelo has been one of John's principal focuses. He's written a noted monograph on Michelangelo's David, and it clearly has been one of his prime interests for some 60 plus years. And what John talks about is not just Michelangelo's art or his sculptures, but also his architecture, Michelangelo's art and his sculpture, but also his architecture and poetry, particularly as it relates to what's going on in Florence and Italy during the 1500s, the high Renaissance period. So John, let me turn the ball over to you about how Michelangelo became Michelangelo. And thanks again for leading us today. So John, you have the ball.
Thank you, Jamie. Welcome, everyone. Before I begin, I see that John Walsh is on the Zoom, and so I should alert you all about his 4 lectures on Mondrian for the Yale Art Gallery, which are online. They're really wonderful, opening up Mondrian's art in all sorts of new and interesting ways. So John, congratulations on those lectures. I know that this talk is supposed to be about the young Michelangelo, and I know that in this image by Daniele da Volterra of about 1545, now in the Metropolitan Museum, that Michelangelo hardly looks young. So rather than give a chronologically exhaustive account of Michelangelo's early years, which others have already done, I would like to suggest what made the man and thus what made his art. Michelangelo was born in 1475 in a small town called Caprese, just outside the city of Florence. He died in Rome in 1564, having had a notably long life. Just 2 generations before Michelangelo, Florentine life expectancy was somewhere in the early 30s, a number inflected by the high incidence of infant mortality. Michelangelo's long life spanned a period of time when his world seemed to be bursting apart at the seams. And even if we now understand that new world is a deeply flawed way of understanding vast parts of our planet, it is certainly true that knowledge of the world is being challenged in deeply unsettling ways. We might also recall that what had for centuries been a singular Christian church, one that was in many instances a source of Michelangelo's patronage, was splitting into multiple and even warring subgroups. Many of you could add a great number more changes than the 2 I have mentioned, but for those interested not just in Michelangelo, but in the structures of our understanding of art and how its history is constructed, perhaps the most notable were the attempts to produce biographies of artists during their own lifetimes. On the screen, you have an image on the left of the first edition of Vasari's Lives of the Most Excellent Architects, Painters, and Sculptors, published in 1515, and its second edition, published 18 years later in 1568. It's not really the first of artists' lives, but it is the first to be produced in this manner and to try to be an encyclopedic history, in this case, a history of Florentine art, because Vasari was not quite Florentine, but wanted to be. The first attempt of Michelangelo's history occurred in 1550 with Vasari's Lives, His three-volume history of Italian art began with Cimabue and tracked the lives of most recently Central Italian artists at the time of Vasari's writing. The edition was enlarged and reprinted in 1568, and you can see it there. It was followed in 1553 by Ascanio Condivi's Vita di Michelangelo Buonarroti, that's on the right side, thought to be driven by Michelangelo's attempt to correct errors that he had found in Vasari's lives. And you see in just a moment why he felt he had to put his own voice in this thing, because Vasari plays fast and loose with the facts because he's got a story that he wants to tell. Both writers, Vasari and Condivi, and the artist himself, were concerned with manufacturing a life of the artist that both presented accessible facts and at the same time felt free to embellish those facts with stories that, while plausible, were inventions to aggrandize the artist's achievements, especially given his age at the time of their publication. He was 75 for Vasari and 78 for Condivi, although this is less true of Vasari than it is for Vasari. So what are these stories, and how are they designed to present not just a narrative about Michelangelo the man, but about Michelangelo the myth, the artistic genius, the standard bearer of the arts of Florence, where he began his public career, and Rome, where after a stay of 34 years, he ended it? Well, let's listen for a moment to Vasari. This is a quote. "The most noble and industrious spirits were striving by the light of the famous Giotto and his followers to give to the world proof of the ability that the benign influence of the stars and the proportionate admixture of humors had given to their intellects, desiring to imitate with the excellence of their art the grandeur of nature, in order to approach as near as possible to that supreme knowledge that many call understanding." Sounds like a course, doesn't it? "They were universally toiling, although in vain. Desiring to deliver us from great errors, he," and that is a capital H, he, so it's not Michelangelo, it's God, "became minded to send down to earth a spirit with universal ability to every art and in every profession," that would include poetry for Michelangelo, "who might be able, working by himself alone, to show what manner of things is the perfection of the art of design in execution, the lines, contours, shadows, and highlights, so as to give relief to works of painting, and what it is to work with correct judgment to sculpture, and how in architecture it is possible to render habitations secure and commodious, healthy and cheerful." That the divine spark that Vasari talks about is a tag that stays with Michelangelo's life, and later on he is called Il Divino, the divine. Condivi's life is somewhat different from Vasari's. It begins not with the divine infusing Michelangelo's person and his art, but by connecting it in a very socially conscious manner with his lineal relation to the Counts of Canossa, who ruled over large areas of northern Italy and who were also involved with the papacy. This goes all the way back to the 12th century. Michelangelo Buonarroti, this is Condivi now. Michelangelo Buonarroti, a singular painter and sculptor, had his origins with the Counts of Canossa, then the lords of Mantua, where the Countess Matilda was born. Please note, as a correlative to his claims that Michelangelo's lineal connections to royalty, Condivi gives Michelangelo a family name, Michelangelo Buonarroti, not the way males of his time were known. He should have been designated Michelangelo di Lodovico. You were known by your father's patronymic. Thus, at the outset, Condivi presents Michelangelo not as a lowly class craftsman, which is really the tradition, remember, that artists for the period of the 14th, 15th, and on into the 16th century really were craftspeople. There was no word for art as we use it until the 16th century. Arte in Italian simply meant craft. You were good at your craft. You weren't il divino. You weren't the divine artist. One might argue that such a transformation of the man may parallel a willful transformation of his art, now not simply as manual labor, but as we now say, art. We will come back to these authors, but at the outset, I thought it would be useful to see how the myth of Michelangelo had already developed by 1550. Sorry. So I want to talk about certain aspects of Michelangelo's life. First, the place. Italians are situated in place. Even today, they are more thinking about themselves as Florentine rather than Italian. And this is true certainly in the 15th and 16th centuries. So Michelangelo is born in this funny little place, Caprese, and this is a view toward Florence from the countryside. Vasari also writes that Michelangelo's father, returning to Florence after serving a term of podestà and then settling in Settignano in a farmhouse that had belonged to his family, and where he apparently found a local peasant woman to nurse his son. So Michelangelo grows up in this kind of environment. And it may sound a bit romantic to bring this kind of place personality into a biography which is supposed to be factual and accurate and all those nice things, scholarly, but I think it's really a part of what makes the man here. Settignano is known for its quarries, its marble quarries that you see on the right-hand screen. So this is where Michelangelo grew up. The image on the left is a funny one, I think. It's in the Palazzo Pitti in Florence now. It's a sculpture of 1861 by a man named Emilio Zocchi, showing Michelangelo carving a mask of a faun in marble. And it's part of this history that I was talking about. So I said Michelangelo grew up here. You know, there is no indication anywhere in the literature about who taught Michelangelo how to carve marble. We know he had an apprenticeship in a painting studio in Florence, so we know how he learned how to paint, or at least we think we do, but there's not a clue how he learned how to sculpt. So I think that we ought to consider, at least, his growing up right here in these quarries, probably running around as a young boy, and probably being trained by people who knew how to carve marble, but not anybody that you would call an artist. They were craftspeople. They knew about the material and how to deal with the material. And Michelangelo, throughout his lifetime, was very, very conscious of the quality of stone that he bought to carve his work. And so he sent a number of blocks of marble back because he found imperfections in the stone. And the imperfection, you can imagine a dark line going straight through the David, not acceptable as far as Michelangelo was concerned. So he has a real sense from his growing up days of the material and how to deal with it. Then he goes to Florence. Given what I said earlier about what Michelangelo's father claimed as his lineage, it's not surprising that Lodovico opposed his son's working with his hands in a craftsman's workshop. Why would an heir to the Counts of Canossa work with his hands, get himself dirty? And you will note, if you just look through images of Michelangelo, particularly drawings of himself, he's always got a cloth wrapped around his head. And it's just a piece of rag to keep the marble dust from getting in his hair and making a mess. So he presents himself in his drawings as this craftsman working with this hard stone. But from 1485 to 1488, he was sent to Florence for schooling with Francesco da Urbino, a humanist scholar, where he most likely had his first encounter with the classics. We should note Michelangelo was only 10 years old when he began this training. But as keen a mind as Michelangelo possessed, as we know from his work and his poetry, in 1487 he began to study in the workshop of Domenico and Davide Ghirlandaio, the brother painters. The terms of Michelangelo's employ were duly noted in the 1488 business records of the Ghirlandaio brothers. quote, "The same brothers, the Ghirlandaios, shall be bound to give him those 3 years 24 florins, of full weight. The first year 6 florins, the second year 8 florins, the third 10 florins. In all, the sum is 96 lira. It's a business contract, and Michelangelo lived up to the terms of the contract. At this point, Michelangelo was 13 years old and in menial labor in the Ghirlandaio shop. In fact, one of the earliest records of Michelangelo's work is that he transported payment funds to Ghirlandaio from one of the painter's clients. So he's running errands as well as learning how to deal with paint. So what do you do if you're an apprentice in a painter's shop? Well, one of the things you do is draw from the old masters. This is a Michelangelo drawing on the left, and on the right is the Masaccio painting in the Church of the Carmine in Florence, the Brancacci Chapel, which you all know from Art 101. And Michelangelo is, in fact, standing in front of the image of St. Peter and the centurion, and Peter giving the tax to the centurion. And Michelangelo is trying to learn from an older master. So he's learning not just craft, how to put pigment on a wall or pigment on a board, but he's learning about pose. He's learning about volume. He's learning about how you make the image, as Vasari says, convincing, naturalistic, realistic. He's also having an opportunity to see what other things are in the painter's shop. And there is a record of Michelangelo copying a painting by Schongauer. This is a painting in the Kimball Art Museum at Fort Worth, which is pretending and think, maybe that's not the right word to use, but at any rate, I obviously have doubts about this, whether it is a Schongauer Temptation of St. Anthony, 1470-75, or whether it's a later copy. Michelangelo had access most likely to the print that was made from this painting, and that appears in the life as if he has a very wide perspective. He's not only looking at Florentine art, but he's looking much more widely. And he's drawing from the model. And you see the nude model on the left and another one on the right. So these incredible drawings. Remember that one of the criteria that Vasari notes as critical in a painter's development was his ability to capture nature. That is, to present the accidentals of what he has seen before him as accurately as possible, feigning reality to make it seem as if the artist depicted were there in front of the viewer. Depictions of the male nude abound in Michelangelo's work, much to the Florida governor's wishes, as you see in these drawings. Some derive from study of ancient sculpture, others from a model. We tend to talk about these as part of workshop practice and the need to represent the form before the artist as accurately as possible, as if the artist's abilities existed only in the artist's hands and not in his mind. If you were the budding artist in front of a life-size marble figure, what would you be thinking? Are these, in fact, live models? Or is Michelangelo looking at ancient sculpture and making drawings after ancient sculpture, which are pretty good in terms of veristic representation? Would you be accompanied by others in conversing about what you had in front of you, say scholars or collectors, as you went about your work? Would your conversation as an artist be part of the learning process, a sharing of knowledge and abilities that would expand the knowledge that both of you would be attempting to acquire? Look at Michelangelo's figure on the right. You see that there are numbers connected by lines to the figures. They are measurements. The Florentine measure is the braccia. It's about 2 feet. Literally, it's an arm's length braccia. They are measurements, and it looks as if the draftsman had attempted in this manner to capture the reality of the figure in a quasi-scientific manner. What you see on the left is the treatise by Vesalius on the human body of 1550, and the Michelangelo drawing on the right. Anatomical studies are not new to this period, but they were becoming more and more accepted and codified. Andreas Vesalius, then a professor at the School of Medicine at the University of Padua, published his De Humani Corporis Fabrica in 1550. It quickly became one of the quintessential study guides for medicine. And I should also point out that these anatomical studies that you're seeing depicted on the left were public demonstrations. Some of them were in a kind of anatomical laboratory, but numbers of them, we have records, took place in the streets so people could see them. They're not hidden away. They're not clandestine, locked away in a room in a medical school. Now, that's one part of Michelangelo's training. There is another. On the left is an aerial view of the piazza that you see on the right. Sorry. This is the Church of San Marco. It's the Medici Church here. And the Piazza Street that goes down here goes right down in front of the Medici Palace to the cathedral. And this is the so-called Medici Sculpture Garden here. And Michelangelo worked there. In fact, he was brought through the intervention of the Ghirlandaio brothers into the Medici household. And he became what was known at the time, not particularly for Michelangelo, but for other artists, as a familiaris, one of the members of the family, living close within the familial structure of the Medici. And so we have to think a little bit, not just of Settignano, not just of the Ghirlandaio workshop, but this other home that he had with the Medici. And it is recorded in this painting, much later painting, by Ottavio Vanini in 1638, that shows one of the early stories of Michelangelo having carved a mask you saw in the Zocchi, 19th century sculpture, having carved a mask of a centaur and presented it to Lorenzo the Magnificent, who's seated there in the middle. Well, let's see about this. Remembering the Vasari quotation at the beginning of the talk, we should keep in mind that Michelangelo's work in the Ghirlandaio shop was essentially an apprenticeship where those with ability in the craft, arte, of painting might move on to open their own workshop and begin to train yet another generation of painters. Those who could not demonstrate sufficient ability might stay on in subordinate roles or choose a subspecialty in the shop with which to specialize, such as decorative designs or preparing the wooden panels of the shop for the master to paint. There are all sorts of menial tasks that need to be done, and if you can't prove yourself as a craftsman with real ability to depict what you've got in front of you, then you could stay on and do the simpler tasks. Michelangelo and another painter, Francesco Granacci, were obviously recognized by Ghirlandaio as having special abilities, and they were invited by the Medici to join a very few other painters and sculptors, as well as classical scholars, to work in the Medici gardens right next to San Marco, as I showed you, in what seems to have been a unique experience to share ideas and to learn from one another. Now, it is interesting that when Lorenzo the Magnificent, who essentially undermined the notion of the Republic for Florence and began, in fact, to assimilate all of the roles of government into his own persona, when asked about this, he was very careful to be both evasive and to use terminology that the Florentines understood. When asked about what he was doing, he claimed that he was maestro della bottega, that is, the master of the workshop. So he's using this humble term, master of the workshop, to talk about how he's taking complete political control of the city. He knows what he's doing, and other people will follow his lead. He, in fact, structures a kind of academy, if you want to use that term, in the Medici Gardens, in the Medici Palace, bringing together poets, writers, scholars, artists in conversation. So it's I suppose, the original cross-disciplinary program. And you see in this painting later, much later painting, you can see Lorenzo and Michelangelo presenting the Maestro della Bottega with his sculpture and writers and others around in conversation. So you have to think really of, I suppose, in some ways, what our museum mentality is like now, of standing in front of an object and having conversation about it. We see them on the screen, we see them in museums, and they're dissociated from that original situation of people coming from various backgrounds, various economic skills, and talking with one another, improving one another's perceptions, understandings. And that is one of the things you're seeing here as part of Michelangelo's training. One of the stories that comes from this time, as you can see here, is carved the head of a fawn. Perhaps one of the reasons the story of the mask is held on so long is that a sculptor also working in the Medici gardens alongside Michelangelo, a man named Pietro Torrigiani, got into a rather heated argument with Michelangelo. He was a real hothead, as was Michelangelo. We don't know what the argument was about, but Michelangelo could also be short-tempered, and the argument ended with Torrigiano punching Michelangelo in the nose and breaking it, leaving him permanently disfigured, as you can see in this drawing. This is a drawing preparatory to a painting, and you can see Michelangelo's nose. Michelangelo's fawn and Michelangelo himself share facial disfigurement, a displacement of the actual broken nose onto the fawn. What does not get talked about in terms of the story of the fawn is what it is that Michelangelo thought he was carving. Was he carving a Michelangelo sculpture based on antiquity, or was he carving a fake antique sculpture? And there's some question, by the way, there are real questions, not just one, about whether this sculpture on the right is really by Michelangelo, whether it's somebody else taking the story and giving us evidence of the story as if it is real. But it's still, we can think about what Michelangelo is doing, carving an antique fawn's head. The question will come up again in Michelangelo's work. And of course, if this is meant to be a sculpture in imitation of antique, how can we even assess whether or not it is by Michelangelo, since the carver would not want it to look like his own work, but like something from another time? So finding Michelangelo's early work is really tricky business. The many and varied influences of his art during his early years help us to understand his transformation of the traditions of both painting and sculpture, and ultimately his being known as Il Divino. Something else that is not discussed enough in terms of the Medici Garden is that it is part of the palace complex. On the left is the courtyard for the Medici Palace. On the right is Donatello's David, which stood in the middle of that courtyard on a column. And also in that space, in the back courtyard, if you go through the back gateway there into the garden area of the palace, there was another Donatello statue, that is the Judith and Holofernes. What are these things doing in the Medici Palace? Well, I talked about that the last time I talked, so I don't need really to say very much about it, excepting that Michelangelo living in this environment is also living with the artists that the Medici thought were important. People like Donatello, the leading sculptor of the 15th century, for example. And Michelangelo, in some ways, learned not just craft, but he learned presentation of subject matter, how imagery conveys meaning and what that meaning can be. He also saw this relief on the right of Donatello's, which was in the Medici collection. And he learned about this funny kind of carving technique by looking at Donatello and some of Donatello's compatriots who work in this form. It's called squashed reliefs, rilievo staccato. And Michelangelo is making a not terribly successful, a Madonna and Child of the Stairs that you see on the left, really trying to train himself in a very, very thin, really, really, really thin relief, squash relief, how to depict space, deep space. While in fact you're flattening out the figure, how can you flatten out the figure the way that figure is flattened out and still have a suggestion of volume and reality? So he's learning by looking at other artists, looking at what other artists do. And in fact, in the 16th century, Michelangelo's own lifetime, it is recognized how much influence Donatello's sculpture had on him. Vasari ends the life of Michelangelo by saying this: either the spirit of Donatello works in Buonarroti, or that of Buonarroti works in Donatello. Of course, that last is an impossibility. There is another sculptor working, that is a familiaris in the Medici household, whose output was very, very, very limited. But he apparently oversaw the Medici collections. He oversaw the manner in which the Medici were collecting, what they were collecting. And he makes, in fact, this relief that you see here on the upper screen, now in the Bargello in Florence. And it is a copy, free copy, but a copy nonetheless, of that antique sarcophagus that was in fragmentary form in Pisa. So what is Bertoldo making? He's making an antique relief, he's making a copy, but in fact, the middle part of that sarcophagus is gone. So he's making a Bertoldo. The borders between making an original and making a copy, making a forgery, let's say it that way, are very, very thin. One has to keep that in mind. There is another view of it, so you can see what he's doing. But anyway, Bertoldo was running that workshop in the Medici Gardens. Michelangelo was involved with him and had firsthand access to Bertoldo's thinking as a very advanced sculptural thinking for the period, particularly when it comes to antiquity. And Michelangelo makes his Battle of the Centaurs at this time as a measure, really, of his understanding what Bertoldo was teaching. It isn't always terribly successful if you look at the lower level of the figures and the way that they're squashed, but it is a measure of the learning process that he's going through and where it is that he's getting some of his ideas. Now, the ideas are not just artistic, how you carve marble, how you slash pigment on a surface. There is a story that Michelangelo was given a commission, and we know the commission, by Pier Francesco de' Medici. He was Lorenzo's son, and when Lorenzo died in 1492, he took over control of the family and ultimately, supposedly, over control of the city of Florence. Like his father, he had never had any kind of training in banking, so the Medici fortunes declined. Unlike his father, he was simply not adept in politics. He didn't really know what he was doing. So he was ultimately thrown out of the city in a quite disgraceful way, literally cast out of the city. And history has referred to him, as it did at the time, as Piero il Fortunato, the unfortunate. He commissioned Michelangelo to do a Hercules. The Hercules statue, we don't know very much about it, except that it ultimately found its way to Fontainebleau, in the ownership of the French, and it subsequently disappeared. But Rubens made a drawing of it, and there it is on the left-hand screen. So what do you make of this man, a Medici, commissioning a Hercules statue? Well, you all know that Hercules is on the state seal of the city of Florence, there. And so it seems, in fact, to be a political statue. We don't know whether it's going to go in the palace or whether the Medici had a different idea of placement, but they are commissioning essentially a civic image. So continuing the kind of what shall I say, political or politicized patronage of the earlier generations. So he's not as stupid as history has made him out to be. And so there's a kind of revisionist history going on now about Piero il Sfortunato. So we have to think a little bit about that also as part of Michelangelo's experience when he's involved in the Medici environment. Then there's another way that artists get their training, and they're really clever at this. Suppose you're working in a town like Florence where the artistic environment, the critical environment, is really quite vicious. You either know what you're doing or you don't. And you're either good or you're really not very good. So what would you do? Do you want to have your sort of also rans not quite there sculpture looked at by your contemporaries who will say, what do you think you're up to? So one of the standard modes of procedure is to get commissions out of town. And Michelangelo, in fact, has a number of commissions out of town. This one is in Bologna. It is for the Ark of San Domenico, Saint Dominic, and it is in the Church of San Domenico in Bologna. It started in the 13th century. It got added to, got moved, and finally in the late 15th century, they're trying to get the thing finished up. And Michelangelo gets a couple of commissions. One for the statue, this one that you see here, of San Petronio, who is patron saint of the city, and one for St. Proclus, who is one of the early saints of the city. So Michelangelo is getting his training outside the city, and that seems to be standard procedure, right? Here is another one of his statues for that Arca San Domenico. Here is the Niccolò dell'Arca from the 60s. This is Michelangelo from the 90s. Not bad, right? But he also goes to Rome. What better place to be than to learn about ancient sculpture, than to look at what's going on in the city of Rome. And he makes this Bacchus for a cardinal. And there's a great deal of commotion about it when it's finished. The cardinal doesn't like it. Ultimately, it is given to a banker, Jacopo Galli, and it is in Jacopo Galli's collection. And I'll show you that in just a moment. But there is another Bertoldo on the right, to give you some indication of Michelangelo looking carefully at Bertoldo's work when he's with the Medici. There is a detail so you can see, but if you look very carefully, if I can get the pointer to work right there, there is a seam because somewhere along the line, Bacchus didn't have a right hand. And the suspicion is that it never had a right hand, that Michelangelo deliberately carved it to make it look like a Roman ruin. That it was found, and not bad. It would have been one of the most complete Roman sculptures in the city of Rome. So it would enhance the collection of Jacopo Galli. You can see this is his garden, and bits and pieces of Roman antiquity scattered about. And then there's this Bacchus, which is parading as a piece of antique sculpture, enhancing Galli's position as a connoisseur, as a collector of antiquities. And ultimately, people understood that it was really by Michelangelo. And there's a great deal of conversation about that. But you have to stop to think about what it is that an artist is being asked to do. Work for himself, work for a patron, make classical sculpture, or what? This is one of his most famous sculptures made in the city of Rome for a French cardinal. And one of the terms in the contract is unique, I think. I've never seen this before. He was to make for the French cardinal, then living in Rome, the most beautiful sculpture in the city of Rome. Well, I don't know that I would take on a contract like that. I mean, how can you win in a situation like that? So what he's doing with this sculpture is really trying to strut his stuff, right? If you look at the piece, there is more drapery work there, here, wherever you look, more than you actually need. Uh, and there's something wrong with this piece too, isn't there? The Virgin is very, very young. Christ died at the age 33, so the Virgin had to have been in her late 40s when he died. That doesn't really look like a woman in her late 40s, particularly for the 16th century, or the late, this is 1499, late 15th century. So all sorts of questions. These are predecessor images on a much more modest scale. They're miniatures. There's a French one, German one. So there are traditions that he's working with, both in painting and in sculpture. And it does seem to me he's working for a French cardinal. And he's using northern traditions of drapery, as you see here, heavily worked traditions of drapery, part of the late Gothic period, because he knows the French cardinals, this is the French cardinals' experience. It may not be his experience, and it's certainly not Roman antique experience, but he's pandering to his patron. I mean, he really does know how to work the system. Now, there are all sorts of stories that Michelangelo sneaked into St. Peter's. And by the way, the sculpture in St. Peter's is for the old St. Peter's, the Constantinian Basilica that was built after 330, not affiliated at all with the present St. Peter's. That the story goes that Michelangelo went into St. Peter's late at night and he heard people talking and attributing this piece of sculpture to a Milanese sculptor. And he was understandably upset. So in the dark of night, he went in and carved his name on the strap across the Virgin's chest there. It is the only piece of sculpture signed by Michelangelo. It's unique that way. And how does he sign it? Michelangelo Buonarroti, where you see it, there. So he signs that surname as a point of pride that he comes from a noble ancestry, that he doesn't come up necessarily through the craft tradition, that he has something else behind him in terms of knowledge, of background, of social status. And it is, in fact, changing in this process the whole status of the artist within the artistic production of the period. And it is a quite extraordinary piece of carving, as you can see. When he's finishing up with this, he hears about a project going on in Florence that some of you may know. And he works very, very hard, as do other sculptors, to get this commission. What you're looking at on the left is the David, of course, but you're looking at a very big block of stone. It's about 17 feet high, close to 18 feet high. And one of the things that you should know is that when Michelangelo got his commission for the David, it was already partially carved. It goes all the way back to 1408 when Donatello gets a commission to carve a buttress figure for the Cathedral of Florence. He doesn't do it, but he goes as far as having Agostino di Duccio, one of his studio assistants, go to Carrara and to quarry this block of marble. And it takes nearly 2 years to get that block of marble quarried and into the city of Florence from Carrara on the coast. Well, it goes from the mountains, quarries, by cart to the sea, onto a boat to the Arno River, and then by barge part of the way until the river was too shallow, and then by ox cart into the city of Florence. The ox cart at one point tips over and the whole marble block falls into the river, and it takes some time to retrieve it. It then goes into the cathedral workshops, and as soon as it arrives in 1466, Donatello dies, and bang, that's the last we hear of the commission. until the 1470s when another sculptor is given the job of carving the statue. Unsuccessful, carves a little bit, gives it up, moves on to other things. Finally, in 1501, Michelangelo is given the commission. And he starts, as Charles Seymour pointed out in his monograph on the David, the document is very, very clear. It says, with one or two blows of his chisel, he knocked a knot off the chest of the figure. And Charles pointed out that that knot is really a sculptor's mark. And you can see it here in this antique sculpture. And they're measuring points so that you can start with a model, small model, and transfer by measuring to a large block of stone and transfer the model from, something table size to 18 feet. So it appears as if there already was a model. Was the model Donatello's model? Well, we'll never know, but more than likely. So Michelangelo is deliberately stepping into the footsteps of Donatello, whose work he had seen in the Medici Palace. And the document, a very, very brief note of he knocked the knot off the chest of the figure, tells us a number of things. One, there was enough carved so that the figure already had a chest. Two, Michelangelo is removing himself from the model and saying, I can do it myself. It's mine. It doesn't belong to Donatello. It doesn't belong to anybody else who's been involved with it. It's mine. It takes him until 1504 to finish the statue, and then it is brought to the town hall. That it was meant, in fact, originally to go in the buttress area of the cathedral. This is a plaster cast that was put up a few years ago just for a matter of a week. So you could get a picture and see what the thing would have looked like had it gone where it was meant to go. It was meant to be a series of these colossal sculptures. And it looks, I guess I should ask, you all are familiar with it as David. Are you convinced that it's David? I don't see anything there that belongs to David. Do you? There's no Goliath's head. There's no sling. He isn't a mid-adolescent. So all the identifying figures of the statue as David are not there. There's that funny piece of, I don't know what, cloth over the shoulder, which seems to be a remnant of something else. So who is it? Maybe it's David. That's one of the terms that appears in the documentation for the piece. But more frequently, the piece is called Il Gigante in the documentation. And it is always referred to publicly as the giant, not Davide. But if I said it was Hercules, would you have a hard time disputing it? That's the Michelangelo's Hercules on the right in the Rubens drawing. Looks pretty much the same, right? Excepting he's missing the club in the same way that he's missing the sling in the Goliath's head. And why would he do something that looked like the Hercules? Hercules is on the state seal in the city of Florence, right? And where does the thing end up? It ends up at the town hall, the Palazzo Vecchio, and it replaces, next to the main door, this statue, which I just showed you earlier on, of the Judith and Holofernes, which had been taken out of the Medici Palace in 1498 when the Medici had been expelled from the city and had been brought to the town hall along with the Donatello bronze David, because that is not private imagery. That is public imagery. It's civic imagery. And it belongs here, not in somebody's house. So Michelangelo's statue replaces the Judith, which is moved just a little bit down the platform in front of the town hall. Subsequently, is moved to the Loggia della Signoria and other places, and is now inside the town hall. So it is very much a part of the civic imagery of the city. And I should also point out that it stands, in fact, for the new republic that reconstitutes itself once the Medici are expelled from the city, and that the autocracy disappears. There are new elections, new town halls, a council of 500, in fact, governing the city, like a Congress governing the city. And this becomes the symbol of that new republic after it is placed there. In fact, when it was carried from the cathedral workshops in a wooden armature, there were some young men that threw stones at it. And it took 3 days to roll it on logs on that armature from the cathedral to the town hall. And in the dark of night, these young men threw stones at the statue. Why did they do that? Because they realized how much it represented an anti-Medician, pro-Republican image for the city, new life for the city. There is a term coming out of Cicero that's also useful to think about here in terms of salus publica, the health of the city. This is what it stands for. And that is a fairly healthy body, I think. But if you look at the drawing on the right, that is Michelangelo making a drawing of the David, making a drawing of a David, not the one he made, obviously, making a drawing of the arm of the David that he does make. And in the drawing, he writes the following: Davide con la fromba e io con l'arco, Michelangelo. David with his sling, and I with my bow, that is the sculptor's drill, and I with my bow, Michelangelo. So he is making an equation between David and all that David stands for, and Michelangelo and all that he stood for as a Florentine, despite his training within the Medici shops. So it stood there next to the cathedral shop, next to the entrance to the Palazzo Vecchio, having removed the Judith. And it is a well understood anti-Medician symbol. So that when the Medici come back into power, once a Medici, Lorenzo's son, is elected Pope in 1513, you have a series of tapestries you see on the upper level of the slide for one of the main rooms of the Palazzo Vecchio. And you have a basamento fresco at the lower level, which was made for the Sala dei Gigli in the Palazzo Vecchio. And I just want you to look. It is the platform in front of the Palazzo Vecchio that you're seeing. There is the David next to the main door. Here is the David next to the main door. And what do you notice about both of those images of the David? He's been decapitated. Do you suppose the people doing these images didn't quite figure out the drawing carefully enough and they just made a mistake? 2 mistakes, the same mistake twice? I suppose you look at the fresco in the bottom and you see this. These are defamation images. These are Medici images made after the Medici regained control of the city. They are decapitating that image. They are deliberately defaming that image. In fact, ridding Florence of that image of the Republic. That notion of freedom, in fact, is still alive in that statue, so that in a demonstration in favor of the Ukrainian state, the image is covered in black in mourning with the Ukrainian flag on it, as if the Florentines not only are in support of the Ukraine, but also understand really very completely how much this statue stood for the Republic, for Republican freedoms. I think I'll stop there. Thank you. Questions, anyone?
John, I would ask if you have a question, put it in the chat room if you would, so at least we get some order out of it. John, one of the obvious questions is, it's a beautiful sculpture, there's no question about it. but there are so many reproductions of it around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Why did it capture the world's imagination the way it did? I mean, I can't think of another sculpture that has captured the imagination the way this one has.
Well, it encapsulates a lot of ideas, right? In terms of Republican freedom, it also, Pace de Santis, it is pretty sexy, right? If you stand around behind the back of the statue in the Accademia in Florence now, and you listen particularly to young women talking about that man's backside, you know that it is quite intriguing. It is very sexy. So it has a kind of physical, emotional draw for lots of people. But also, it's 18 feet high. It's quite an achievement. And I should say, technically, it's an achievement too, because if you look very, very carefully at the statue, at the ankles of the statue, you will see that there are hairline cracks on both ankles. And the city is very, very worried that if there are earth tremors, as there often are in Florence, that these cracks will develop further and the whole statue could topple over and become just a pile of dust and marble fragments. And in fact, during the Second World War, when they were worried about the bombing and the dynamiting of the bridges, the statue was covered over with a wooden armature and sandbags so that it couldn't move. It had just enough give to respond to the tremors from the dynamiting of all the bridges, that it would be safe. So I think size is a function, the quality of the carving. I mean, it really does look like a human being. How do you do that? So there is that recognition. And there is the history that goes behind it, which is repeated over and over and over again, right here until just 2 years ago.
Okay, there are other questions?
I can't imagine the class of 1961 being
I
quiet.
can't. Let's see if we can.
I don't see anything in the chat at the moment.
God, you're all like a bunch of undergraduates. Well, I hope you'll get a chance to see it. Remember the one outside the Palazzo Vecchio now that this flag is draped around is a replica from the 19th century. The original is in the Accademia, and the Accademia, interestingly enough, as a museum, was built around this sculpture. It was built specifically for this sculpture. And if you think about architectural iconography, when you go into the Accademia in Florence, you will see that you walk into the building through a long nave to a cross arm and to an apse. In fact, the Accademia, the old building, the Accademia, is in fact designed like a church, with this statue to be venerated where the altar would be in a church. That's also part of the way that the Florentines sell this statue as a kind of holy image for people to come and see. The architectural iconography is part of the history of this statue.
John, Michael Enrico asked a question. Is there any comment about the proportion of the right arm?
Yeah, there are worries. The head is slightly too large, and the right hand is too large. The head may be too. Remember where it was meant to go, on the baptistery of the cathedral. If you're meant to see small details of the figure, like facial features or the structure of the hand, you could think about enlarging him. There's also a phrase in the political literature and the poetry of the time of manu fortis, of the strong hand, the strong arm of righteousness. And I think iconographically, the enlarged hand is part of that medieval tradition of the strong right arm. And, basically most people don't notice that very much. You notice the hand more than the head, actually, in part because you're closer to the hand than you are closer to the head. I mean, on the podium, in which the statue is placed in the Accademia, you're what? From the head is 18 feet high off the ground if it's on the ground. So 18, you're about 25 feet away from the head. And just think about looking 25 feet and trying to get distinctions. And then think that the statue is really meant to go on the buttress area. Others, Jamie.
There are a few in the chat. So the first one is there any comment about the proportion of the right arm? We just did that one, sorry. I had not thought clearly about the biblical symbolism. David was a savior in battle for the Jews. Is that the current perception?
Yes. I mean, the phrase is, let me see if I can recall it. Saul killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. It's not a pretty story, right? And the story has been modified over time to create this heroic figure who killed what? The giant. So here you have the inverse of the puny little adolescent killing the giant, and now the puny little adolescent himself is a giant. So there are all sorts of plays on the biblical tale. And transforming that adolescent into a mature male, changing his size, is I guess, a reference to victory, the power of righteousness here.
You hear me now? Yeah, John, thank you. Again, this was bafflingly learned and advanced. And I was wondering if you could remind us old codgers of the age of Michelangelo when he did the work in the Sistine Chapel and the extent of that work.
All right, I will tell the rest of you that this is my old roommate speaking up, and he is continuing a tradition of some 60 years ago asking tough questions. All right, Michelangelo begins the Sistine ceiling in 1508, finishes it in 1512. So he's 25 plus 8. He's 33 years old when he begins the Sistine ceiling. And there was already a ceiling there. The Sistine vault was painted blue and had a series of stars painted on it in gold that were, in fact, particular constellations. It was part of the chapel decoration when it was built under Sixtus IV. That's why it's called the Sistine Chapel. In the third quarter of the 15th century. And Michelangelo, when he got that commission, was told by the Pope, Julius II, who was a quite strong-willed man. Remember, you see Julius II in portraiture having this great big beard. He has that beard for military reasons. He was trying to keep control of the Papal States, which extended as far north as Bologna. Bologna didn't like being controlled by the papacy and was revolting. And Julius said, I will not shave until I've regained control of Bologna. He died with his beard. So he is the nephew, Julius II is the nephew of Sixtus IV, to tell you something about the way religious structures worked during this time. He got his position in part through his uncle, Sixtus IV. He was very strong-willed, and he was determined, in fact, to transform the city of Rome into a new Rome, basically. Rome in 1500, as you can imagine, was a bit of a wreck. It had been overrun in the Middle Ages. Buildings had been falling down. And Julius begins really quite dynamic building processes to make Rome again the capital of the world. The current St. Peter's is his building. Buildings designed first by Bramante and then finished by Michelangelo. So that sort of control of the world, making Rome the new Rome, is part of the Sistine Chapel too, after all. He's taking his uncle's commission, he's stripping the ceiling of the imagery that was there, stars, and what he wanted, the commission originally for Michelangelo, was to make 12 prophets in the spandrels of the windows. Michelangelo thought, not so keen about that. So he proposed something else, and he couldn't get an audience with the Pope. Then he stayed a little bit longer, still couldn't get an audience with the Pope. And so he said, all right, if the Pope's looking for me, I'm in Florence, he can come and find me. I'm not going to hang around here anymore and have my ideas fall on deaf ears. And Julius recanted. I mean, so that instead of these 12 apostle figures, Michelangelo transformed the ceiling and made the prophet figures up on the ceiling, and then made the story of creation in three separate, three nine separate scenes along the ceiling itself. So a dynamic transformation of the 15th century imagery into the powerful imagery you see, starting with creation, after all, for a man who is beginning a new recreation of the city of Florence. City of Rome.
Great.
Is that okay,
Thanks.
Robert?
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, the next question we have is, can you refresh my memory of seeing the Pietà in America?
I'm sorry, seeing the what?
Pietà,
In America.
yes.
No, the lines went around the block, and so I didn't stand in the line. It's one of the problems we have, isn't it? That there are, and it was raised earlier, just a few minutes ago, that there are some images that capture the popular imagination, and no matter what you do, you can't unmoor them from that imagination. What did people see when they went there at the Met to see the Pietà? They had, maximum 2 minutes before they were pushed along in line. You can't see anything in 2 minutes. You could barely read the inscription in 2 minutes. And then if you read the inscription, so what? I mean, at some level, I suppose it's nice for people to say, I've seen the Michelangelo Pietà. On the other hand, they didn't know what they were seeing. The museum made no particular attempt to train them or to teach them what they were seeing, tell them what they were seeing, why it was important, where it stood in Michelangelo's career. The fact of the matter is he wasn't even making antique art. There's Michelangelo, supposedly one of the stalwarts of the renewal of classical antiquity. And there he's making a piece of Gothic sculpture. I mean, there are questions all over the place. And how can you even address the questions, even dream up the questions, if you're given 2 minutes in front of the statue? I thought the whole thing was a public relations scandal. I'm sorry. I guess I shouldn't carry on that way, but I think museums have responsibility, and the Metropolitan abrogated its responsibility in that exhibition. It wasn't an exhibition. It was nothing more than you would see in a slide. Next question.
Okay, the next one says, I've heard that Michelangelo felt that the sculpture he was working on was already in the stone, and his job was to chip away at the stone and reveal it. Any truth to this idea?
Well, how do I answer that question? I guess the answer is yes and no. Look, one of the things that happens if you're a carver is that you make some drawings. You decide what it is you're going to do. You probably scribble down some drawings of the figure that you're thinking you're going to carve. Then you decide what the size is going to be. And then you get your tape measure and you go to Carrara or Settignano or wherever there is good marble, and you have the thing quarried. So by the time you get to the quarry, you already have some idea of what it is that you're going to carve. Now, that idea is in your head. And from your head, you transform it into that rectangular block of marble. Maybe it may not even be rectangular, of course. you have to pay for the marble by weight. So transporting the marble from Carrara to Florence to your workshop is done by weight. So you have chipped off as much of the excess marble as you think you can reasonably without damaging the concept that you already have. I mean, I think we always think of the artist's work as being in his or her hand. But you know, before you pick up the brush or before you pick up the chisel, you got an idea. So if the idea is there, then of course, the only thing you have to do is chip away the block until you get the idea revealed. Now, that's not to say that there aren't changes of ideas as you proceed, or if you find an imperfection in the marble, how do you deal with the imperfection? Do you throw the whole piece of marble away? Or do you shift your composition ever so slightly so that you can chip away the imperfection and still have a beautiful piece of marble in your finished sculpture? So I'm not really trying to avoid the question, but I do think the answer is both yes and no.
I think that answers it. There's another very similar question, so I think that you hit both of those. The next one is the distortion. Is the distortion a product of Michelangelo perceiving the perceptive of the view from the ground?
Yeah, I think it is. I think he's trained in that with Donatello. If you look at the Donatello sculpture for the facade of the Cathedral of Florence, the seated St. John figure, there were 4 evangelist figures that were meant to go on either side of the door of the Cathedral of Florence in niches. They're over life-size figures. They're in the Duomo Museum now. You will see that if you look at an image of a photograph of the Donatello seated St. John, taken straight on, it looks as if the torso is really too long and the hand is limp. It really sort of, good God, what is he thinking? And the arm doesn't quite get back to the main torso in the way that you think it might. However, if you look at photographs taken from below, because the statue is meant to go on a niche quite high above your head, probably a niche beginning, maybe 10 feet above your head. If you look at photographs taken of that statue from below, it's a very different statue. It really works. The torso sits in the frame of the body. The hand really comes forward in a very strong and determined way, resting on the Bible. Yes, I think there is awareness on the part of artists all the way through the 15th century of where their things are going to go. Some people respond better to it than others. Some people are just in a rush to get their money, and so they do it quickly and don't take the time. But I think that the sculptural studios understand that placement is consideration of placement is part of their work.
And we have one more. It's a comment and a question. So I'm going to read it to you, John. It says, this is from Richard. I remember a notice in Vanderbilt Hall our freshman year seeking someone to accompany him on a trip to Europe. That person apparently had a physical handicap that caused him to need assistance. You were that lucky guy who got the job, and the rest is history. At one of our reunions, you told me that you would not be the Professor John Paoletti that you have become had you not had that experience. You have told us how Michelangelo became Michelangelo. Please share with us the story of how young John Paoletti became the distinguished Professor Paoletti. Thank you.
Oh dear, I'm going to be embarrassed now. Well, I learned about that job over dinner one night in Commons. You remember we all had freshman advisors who were graduate students. Our freshman advisor was a medical school student, and he had the job the summers before. And he said, I know somebody that's going to Italy this summer who's going to pay all expenses and a salary. Is anybody interested? Of course, everybody at the table jumped, but I was the only one that followed the lead. The man had Parkinson's, so he had to have somebody with him that would be careful to assure that he would not fall. He was very kind, would go to see anything that I wanted to see, and I was able to travel with him for the 4 summers of our undergraduate years, with the result that I saw a lot. And he was kind enough. I had just taken, sophomore year, I'd just taken a Byzantine course, and he said, "Where would you like to go?" And I said, "Well, you know, Istanbul is a really fascinating city, and there's wonderful stuff there. By God, you know, that was before anybody went to Istanbul. There was only one flight in a day, Pan American 1, that was the round the world Pan American flight. And we went to Istanbul, so I got a chance to see the stuff. So, you know, my training was a visual training. I didn't, I mean, there were lots of people who were better in the classroom than I was. Lots of people in the major that were stronger art history majors than I was. John Walsh, our classmate, is one of them. But I saw the stuff. I had early exposure to the stuff. And since it was just the two of us, I didn't have somebody yammering at me about what I was meant to know about this thing or what somebody else knew and wanted to pass on to me. I had to figure it out for myself. I will also say that the field has changed dramatically since I began. It was kind of whodunits when I started. And all of you remembering those walls and walls of photographs that one had to memorize for final exams in any art history course. I would no more do that to a student now than I would fly to the moon. Much more now we're dealing with history. I ran into trouble with people on the faculty when I was a graduate student because I really wanted to include history. I once asked the director of graduate studies if I could take a history course, Italian Renaissance course, for credit. And I was told, why would you want to do that? So, you know, in some ways, my closest, what shall I say, colleagues in terms of the business and learning have been historians, Australian historians and British historians, who helped me to pair the visual material that I knew with the historical material which they knew to come up with some maybe new readings. I think that's all you need to know about me. I love this stuff.
Thank you, John. As Andy Block cites here, he says, well done. Isn't it amazing that we have 2 art Hall of Famers in our class, you and John Walsh. And I want to thank you for this presentation today and your one last year. You've certainly enlightened me. Others may be much further enlightened before they listen to you. But thank you very much for your talk today. Fascinating.
I enjoyed it. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.